The monsoon rain had stopped just before dawn. A thick fog rolled in from the South China Sea, swallowing the coastline in a grey shroud that seemed to erase the boundary between water and sky. Somewhere along the Sontra Peninsula, in the early hours of March 1967, a young Navy lieutenant named Thomas Brennan stood at the edge of a beach that officially did not exist. He watched the waves break against the shore in rhythmic silence, each crest dissolving into foam before retreating back into the darkness. Behind him, hidden beneath camouflage netting and dense tropical vegetation, lay a complex of structures that would never appear on any official military map. Radio antennas disguised as palm trees, bunkers carved into the hillside, and a series of concrete boat ramps that descended into the water like the fingers of a hand reaching toward the horizon. Brennan had arrived in Vietnam 6 weeks earlier, assigned to a unit whose name was as deliberately mundane as its mission was extraordinary. The Naval Advisory Detachment. 3 words that revealed nothing about the men who served there or the operations they conducted under the cover of darkness. What he had learned in those 6 weeks had fundamentally altered his understanding of the war. The beaches of Vietnam were not merely stretches of sand where soldiers could escape the jungle for a few hours of rest. They were arteries of a secret war, points of entry and exit for missions that the American public would not learn about for decades. They were staging grounds for infiltrations into North Vietnam, training sites for indigenous commandos, and launching platforms for operations that violated international agreements signed in Geneva. The beach where Brennan now stood was one of dozens scattered along Vietnam's 2,000-mile coastline. Some were hidden in plain sight, disguised as recreation facilities where soldiers could surf and swim between patrols. Others were buried deep in the jungle, accessible only by boat or helicopter, known only to the men who operated from them and the enemies who hunted them. This is the story of those beaches. The secret installations that transformed Vietnam's coastline into a theater of shadow warfare. The men who built them, fought from them, and sometimes died on their sands without ever receiving recognition for their sacrifice. It is a story of courage and deception, of innovation and tragedy, of a war within a war that remained hidden for 3 decades after the last American helicopter lifted off from Saigon. To understand how Vietnam's beaches became hidden military bases, one must first understand the nature of the conflict itself. The Vietnam War was never a conventional struggle between clearly defined armies fighting across established front lines. It was a war of infiltration and interdiction, of supply routes and coastal waters, of agents slipping through the night and ships disappearing into fog. From the earliest days of American involvement, military planners recognized that Vietnam's geography presented both a challenge and an opportunity. The country's long, winding coastline was a natural highway for the movement of men and material. North Vietnam could use the sea to supply its forces in the south, bypassing the dangerous overland routes through Laos and Cambodia. But that same coastline could also be used against them, as a platform for strikes into the north and a barrier to prevent supplies from reaching Viet Cong fighters in the south. The beaches became the front line of this maritime war, not the beaches that tourists would later flock to, with their white sand and gentle waves, but hidden coves and isolated stretches of coast where the jungle met the sea in impenetrable tangles of mangrove and bamboo. In 1961, the Central Intelligence Agency began establishing a network of coastal installations in South Vietnam. These were not the massive bases that would later dominate the American military presence, with their air-conditioned barracks and PX stores selling American cigarettes. They were small covert facilities designed to support operations that the United States government would officially deny. The first of these installations was established near Da Nang, on a strip of beach that would later become famous under a different name. Here, CIA personnel began training South Vietnamese commandos for missions into North Vietnam. The men learned to navigate by stars, to swim through heavy surf, to land on hostile beaches in total darkness. They practiced with demolitions, communications equipment, and weapons that left no identifying marks. The training was brutal, and the missions that followed were often fatal. Teams of South Vietnamese agents were inserted along the North Vietnamese coast by fast patrol boats tasked with sabotage, intelligence gathering, and the establishment of resistance networks. Most were captured within days of their insertion. Many were executed. Others disappeared into the prison system of North Vietnam, their fates unknown for years. But the program continued, driven by the belief that unconventional warfare could achieve what conventional forces could not. And as the program expanded, so did the network of secret beaches that supported it. By 1964, when the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, established its Studies and Observations Group, the coastline had become a patchwork of hidden installations. Some were elaborate complexes with hardened bunkers and sophisticated communications equipment. Others were little more than cleared patches of sand where boats could be beached and supplies cached beneath the vegetation. Each installation had its own character, shaped by the geography of its location and the nature of the operations it supported. Some specialized in agent insertion, launching small teams into North Vietnam on missions that were never officially acknowledged. Others served as listening posts, monitoring radio traffic and tracking the movement of enemy vessels along the coast. Still others were training facilities where Americans and South Vietnamese worked together to develop the tactics that would define maritime, unconventional warfare. What united them all was secrecy. The men who served at these installations operated under cover identities. They wore no insignia, carried no identification, used weapons with filed-off serial numbers. They could not tell their families where they were stationed or what they were doing. Many signed documents acknowledging that if they were captured, the United States government would deny any knowledge of their existence. This was the world that Lieutenant Thomas Brennan had entered when he stepped off the helicopter at Da Nang and was driven to a beach that appeared on no official map. A world where the line between ally and enemy was often unclear, where success was measured in intelligence gathered rather than territory captured, and where the sand beneath his feet held secrets that would remain buried for decades. The fog was beginning to lift now, revealing the outline of the mountains that rose behind the beach. In a few hours, the installation would come alive with activity. Boats would be prepared, equipment checked, briefings conducted for missions that would launch after nightfall. But for now, in the grey light of dawn, Brennan stood alone on the sand, watching the waves and wondering what the coming months would bring. He could not have known that the beach where he stood would become one of the most active covert installations of the war. That the operations launched from this stretch of sand would contribute to some of the conflict's most significant intelligence coups, that men he would come to know as brothers would die on beaches just like this one, their bodies sometimes recovered, sometimes lost forever to the sea. All he knew in that moment was that the war he had imagined bore little resemblance to the war he had found. The beaches of Vietnam were not places of respite from the fighting. They were the fighting, conducted in shadows, shrouded in secrecy, and carrying consequences that would ripple through decades. The monsoon rain began again, light at first, then building to a steady downpour that turned the sand dark and sent streams of water running down toward the sea. Brennan pulled his poncho tighter and headed back toward the hidden bunkers where his new life was about to begin. Behind him, the waves continued their eternal rhythm, carrying with them the secrets of a coast that had seen centuries of conflict and would see centuries more. The sand that had witnessed the departure of French colonial forces would now witness the arrival of American special operators. The coves that had hidden fishing boats during typhoons would now shelter fast patrol craft loaded with commandos and explosives. The beaches of Vietnam were about to enter their most turbulent chapter, and the men who would fight from them were about to learn that some secrets are worth keeping, and some costs are worth paying, even when no one will ever know what was sacrificed. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every week, we uncover forgotten chapters of military history that mainstream documentaries ignore, bringing you the untold stories of the men who fought in the shadows so that future generations might live in the light. Subscribe now and become part of a community that honors the truth, no matter how long it remained hidden. The discovery came on February 16, 1965, in a remote bay along the central Vietnamese coast. Lieutenant James Bowers was flying a routine medical evacuation mission when he noticed something unusual in the waters below. A large vessel, perhaps 100 feet long, was beached perpendicular to the shore, its hull partially covered with tree branches and brush in a crude attempt at camouflage. Bowers circled twice, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Cargo was being unloaded from the vessel and stacked on the beach. Men were moving between the ship and the tree line, carrying crates that could only contain one thing: weapons. Within hours, South Vietnamese naval forces and American advisors had converged on Vung Ro Bay. What they found confirmed the worst fears of military planners in Saigon and Washington. The vessel was a North Vietnamese steel-hulled trawler, disguised as a fishing boat, loaded with enough weapons and ammunition to arm an entire regiment of Viet Cong fighters. The manifest of captured supplies read like a catalogue of destruction. Over 100 tons of military equipment, including rifles, machine guns, recoilless rifles, mortars, and hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition. Medical supplies, communications equipment. Everything a guerrilla army needed to sustain a prolonged campaign against the South Vietnamese government and its American allies. The Vung Ro Bay incident was a watershed moment in the Vietnam War. It provided what intelligence analysts had long suspected but never proven. The North Vietnamese were using the sea to supply their forces in the south, running a maritime infiltration operation that bypassed the heavily interdicted overland routes. The response was immediate and far-reaching. Within weeks, the United States Navy launched Operation Market Time, a coastal surveillance and interdiction program that would eventually involve hundreds of vessels and aircraft patrolling Vietnam's 200-mile coastline. The mission was simple to state and nearly impossible to execute: stop the flow of supplies from North to South Vietnam by sea. But Market Time was only the visible component of America's response to the maritime threat. Behind the patrol boats and surveillance aircraft, a shadow operation was taking shape, one that would transform Vietnam's beaches from potential landing sites for enemy infiltrators into fortified bases for American counter-operations. The Naval Advisory Detachment at Da Nang was expanded and reorganized. New facilities were constructed at strategic points along the coast, hidden from aerial observation and accessible only to those with the proper clearances. These installations would serve as the headquarters for a maritime unconventional warfare campaign that would operate in parallel with Market Time, but would remain classified for decades after the war ended. The beaches selected for these installations shared certain characteristics. They were isolated, protected from observation by terrain or vegetation, and accessible by water even in rough weather. They had sufficient depth offshore for fast patrol boats to approach without running aground, and they offered natural concealment for the structures and equipment that would be positioned there. At these hidden beaches, a different kind of war was being fought. While Market Time focused on interdiction and defense, the covert installations supported offensive operations. Teams of South Vietnamese commandos, trained and advised by American special operators, were launched against targets along the North Vietnamese coast. Fast patrol boats, delivered to the program from Norway and refitted for covert operations, conducted hit-and-run strikes against radar stations, supply depots, and military facilities. The Norwegian-built vessels were known as Nasty-class patrol boats, a designation that seemed to describe their mission as much as their design. Fast, heavily armed, and capable of operating in shallow coastal waters, they were the perfect platform for the kind of strikes the program envisioned. Each boat carried a crew of 14 and could reach speeds of over 40 knots, fast enough to strike and withdraw before enemy forces could respond. The Nasty boats operated from beaches that had been specifically prepared to support them. Boat ramps were constructed of reinforced concrete, angled to allow the vessels to be pulled out of the water and concealed during daylight hours. Bunkers were dug into the sand and hillsides, housing the fuel, ammunition, and spare parts that kept the boats operational. Communication centers were established, linking the forward installations with headquarters in Da Nang and Saigon. The men who crewed these boats were a mixed force of American advisors and South Vietnamese sailors. The Americans were officially prohibited from accompanying the boats on missions into North Vietnamese waters, a restriction that was observed more in the breach than in practice. Many advisors simply ignored the prohibition, reasoning that their presence was essential to the success of operations, and that the distinction between advisory and operational roles was meaningless in the context of the missions they were conducting. Life at the hidden coastal installations was characterized by long periods of waiting, punctuated by intense bursts of activity. Days might pass with nothing more demanding than maintenance and training. Then, often with little warning, orders would come down for a mission, and the beach would transform into a hive of purposeful movement. Boats would be prepared and loaded. Final briefings would be conducted, reviewing targets, routes, and contingency plans. Communications would be checked and rechecked. Medical supplies would be positioned in case of casualties, and then, as darkness fell, the boats would slide down the ramps into the water and disappear into the night. The missions varied in their objectives, but shared a common pattern: approach the target under cover of darkness, relying on radar evasion techniques and the boat's shallow draft to avoid detection. Strike quickly and violently, using the element of surprise to maximize damage before enemy forces could respond. Withdraw at maximum speed, using the darkness and the boat's superior performance to escape pursuit. Not all missions were successful. North Vietnamese coastal defenses were formidable and improving constantly. Radar coverage extended for miles offshore, and shore batteries were positioned to cover the most likely approach routes. Enemy patrol boats prowled the waters, and aircraft were on standby to respond to any incursion. Some boats returned from missions shot full of holes, their crews wounded but alive. Others never returned at all. The men lost on these operations simply vanished, their fates unknown to their families, their service unacknowledged by their government. They became the first of what would eventually number in the hundreds, Americans and South Vietnamese, who died conducting operations that officially did not exist. The hidden beaches where these operations originated became sanctuaries of a sort, places where men could prepare for missions and recover from them, where they could maintain the equipment and hone the skills that kept them alive. But they were sanctuaries under constant threat, vulnerable to the same enemy forces they were designed to strike. Security at the installations was multi-layered and paranoid. Perimeters were patrolled constantly. Approach routes were booby-trapped and mined. Local populations were monitored for any sign of enemy infiltration or sympathies. And the locations themselves were changed periodically, with entire installations being abandoned and rebuilt elsewhere to prevent the enemy from learning their positions. Despite these precautions, the hidden beaches were not immune to attack. Viet Cong sappers probed their defenses regularly, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited. Mortar rounds sometimes fell on the installations, fired from positions in the surrounding jungle, and the constant fear of a major assault forced the defenders to maintain a level of vigilance that was exhausting in its intensity. The men who served at these installations developed a unique culture, shaped by the secrecy of their mission and the danger of their circumstances. They could not discuss their work with outsiders, could not seek recognition for their achievements, could not even acknowledge the existence of the units in which they served. They formed tight bonds with their comrades, knowing that these were the only people who would ever understand what they had experienced. They also developed a dark humor, a coping mechanism for the stresses they faced. Jokes about death and disaster were common, a way of acknowledging the dangers without being paralyzed by them. Rituals developed around missions, small superstitions that the men believed would bring them home safely. And when comrades were lost, the grief was intense but private, expressed in ways that would not compromise the secrecy of the mission. The hidden beaches of Vietnam were becoming more than military installations. They were communities of a sort, bound by shared danger and common purpose. And the war they were fighting, invisible to the outside world, was shaping the course of the larger conflict in ways that would not be understood for years to come. 8 miles south of Da Nang, where the South China Sea met a crescent of white sand backed by limestone cliffs, there existed a place that embodied the contradictions of the Vietnam War. To the thousands of American servicemen who rotated through on their in-country rest and recuperation leave, it was a paradise. 3 days of swimming, surfing, and sunbathing, a temporary escape from the jungle and the constant threat of death. They knew it as China Beach, a name that would later become famous through a television series that captured only a fraction of its reality. But China Beach had another face, one that the soldiers relaxing on its sands never saw. Behind the recreation facilities, hidden by terrain and security checkpoints, was one of the most active covert installations of the war. From this beach, operations were launched that would shape the course of the conflict. And the juxtaposition of leisure and war, of surfboards and patrol boats, created a surreal atmosphere that those who experienced it would never forget. Sergeant Michael Dawson arrived at China Beach in September 1968, assigned to the 5th Communications Battalion with orders to report to a unit that did not appear in any organizational chart. He had expected the assignment to be administrative, perhaps monitoring radio traffic or maintaining equipment. What he found was something entirely different. The first clue that his assignment was unusual came when he was directed away from the main recreation complex, past a series of checkpoints that required clearances he did not yet possess. The second clue came when he noticed the men around him were not wearing the standard uniforms of rear echelon troops. They moved differently, with the watchful alertness of men who had seen combat. And they carried weapons even within the confines of the installation, something that would have been unusual at any other rear area base. The installation where Dawson would spend the next 14 months was built into a hillside overlooking a small cove, invisible from the main beach and accessible only through a series of switchbacks that could be easily defended. From the outside, it appeared to be nothing more than a cluster of supply bunkers, unremarkable among the thousands of similar structures scattered across Vietnam. Inside, it was a sophisticated operations center, equipped with communications gear that could reach anywhere in Southeast Asia, and staffed by men whose skills had been honed in the most demanding training programs the military could devise. This was the headquarters of the Naval Advisory Detachment's operational element, the nerve center for maritime unconventional warfare operations along the central Vietnamese coast. From here, missions were planned, launched, and controlled. Intelligence was gathered, analyzed, and disseminated. And the hidden war that was being fought from Vietnam's beaches was coordinated with a precision that belied the apparent chaos of the larger conflict. Dawson's job was communications, but in this context, communications meant something far more complex than radio operation. He would spend his tour monitoring encrypted transmissions, coordinating with aircraft and surface vessels, and maintaining contact with teams operating deep in enemy territory. He would learn to recognize the voices of men he had never met, to interpret the coded phrases that signaled success or disaster, and to remain calm when those voices suddenly went silent. The operations launched from China Beach targeted the full spectrum of North Vietnamese maritime activity. Fast patrol boats conducted reconnaissance missions along the enemy coast, mapping radar installations and identifying targets for future strikes. Teams of commandos were inserted on beaches similar to the one from which they departed, tasked with sabotage, intelligence gathering, and the capture of prisoners who might provide valuable information. Other operations were more complex, involving coordination with aircraft, submarines, and forces operating far from the coast. Agents were delivered to predetermined points where they would begin long-term infiltration missions. Equipment was cached at locations where it could be recovered by resistance forces, and psychological operations were conducted, intended to undermine North Vietnamese morale and create confusion among enemy forces. The men who conducted these operations came from every branch of the American military and from the ranks of the South Vietnamese Armed Forces. Navy SEALs trained indigenous commandos in the tactics of beach reconnaissance and underwater demolition. Army Special Forces advisors accompanied South Vietnamese teams on missions that ventured deep into enemy territory. Marine reconnaissance specialists provided intelligence on coastal defenses and potential landing sites. And yet, just a few hundred meters away, other Americans were learning to surf. The China Beach Surf Club had been established in 1967, an informal organization of servicemen who had discovered that the waves breaking along this stretch of coast were as good as any in California or Hawaii. They built a lifeguard tower, painted it in bright colors, and equipped it with a collection of surfboards that were passed from one rotation to the next. For many soldiers, the surf club was their first introduction to the sport. They learned to paddle out through the breaking waves, to read the swells, to stand up on a board that seemed determined to throw them off. The more experienced surfers among them became instructors, sharing techniques they had learned on beaches half a world away. The juxtaposition was bizarre and somehow appropriate. Men who had been fighting for their lives in the jungle just days before were now floating in warm water, waiting for the perfect wave. The sound of artillery that could be heard from almost anywhere in Vietnam was replaced by the crash of surf and the calls of seabirds. For a few hours it was possible to forget that a war was being fought at all. But the war was never far away. Periodically, the beach would be closed due to enemy activity in the area. Occasionally, rounds would land close enough to send swimmers scrambling for cover, and always there was the knowledge that the rest period was temporary, that soon the men would return to their units and the fighting that awaited them. The soldiers who surfed at China Beach knew nothing of the covert installations hidden in the hills behind them. They did not know that the boats they sometimes saw heading out to sea at dusk were not fishing vessels, but fast patrol craft loaded with commandos and explosives. They did not know that the radio antennas visible on the ridgeline were not standard communications equipment, but sophisticated systems for coordinating operations across the theater. This was by design. The compartmentalization of information was essential to the security of the covert operations. The fewer people who knew about the hidden installations, the less chance there was that the information would reach the enemy. And so, the two faces of China Beach existed side by side, each unaware of the other, each serving its purpose in the larger war. For those who served at the covert installation, the presence of the recreation facility was both a blessing and a curse. It provided cover for their activities, a plausible explanation for the personnel and material that flowed through the area, but it also created complications, as soldiers on leave sometimes wandered into areas they were not supposed to see, and security had to be maintained without creating suspicion. The men who worked at the installation developed their own relationship with the beach. When their duties allowed, they would slip down to the water for a swim, enjoying the same waves that the R&R soldiers were riding. But they could never fully relax, never completely set aside the weight of what they knew and what they had done. The beach was a reminder of the normal world that existed beyond the war, a world they might someday return to if they survived. Some of them did not survive. Operations launched from China Beach claimed lives with a regularity that those who conducted them came to accept as inevitable. Bodies were sometimes recovered, sometimes not. Families were notified of deaths in combat, but the circumstances were never explained. The men who died on these operations were honored in private ceremonies at the installation, their names added to lists that would remain classified for decades. If this story is touching something deep within you, pause for a moment and leave a comment below saying, "Every hidden hero deserves to be remembered." Let us honor together those who fought in silence so that we might live in peace. The hidden beaches of Vietnam were taking their toll, but the operations they supported continued, driven by the belief that unconventional warfare could achieve what conventional forces could not. And the men who served at those beaches continued their work, knowing that their sacrifice might never be acknowledged, their heroism never recognized. As 1968 turned to 1969, the character of the war began to change. The Tet Offensive had shattered American confidence in the war's progress. Peace negotiations had begun in Paris, and the pressure to reduce American involvement was growing with each passing month. But the covert operations continued. The hidden beaches remained active, and the men who fought from them continued to believe that their work mattered, even as the larger war seemed to be slipping away. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox was patrolling international waters in the Gulf of Tonkin when its radar operators detected high-speed contacts approaching from the west. What followed would become one of the most controversial incidents of the Vietnam War, a trigger for the massive American escalation that would define the conflict for the next decade. The official story was straightforward. North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked an American destroyer in international waters, an unprovoked act of aggression that demanded a response. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution within days, giving President Johnson the authority to use military force without a formal declaration of war. But the full story was far more complex, and it began on the hidden beaches of South Vietnam. In the weeks before the Maddox incident, fast patrol boats operating from covert coastal installations had been conducting a series of raids against North Vietnamese targets. These operations, codenamed Oplan 34 Alpha, were part of the maritime unconventional warfare program that had been running since the early 1960s. They were designed to put pressure on North Vietnam, to force Hanoi to divert resources to coastal defense, and to demonstrate that the South and its American allies could strike at will. The raids were not directly connected to the Maddox's patrol, but the North Vietnamese did not know that. From their perspective, American destroyers operating in the Gulf of Tonkin and the fast patrol boats striking their coast were part of a coordinated operation. The attack on the Maddox, if indeed it occurred as reported, may have been a response to the covert raids that had been conducted in the preceding days. The truth of what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin on August 2nd and August 4th, 1964, remains disputed to this day. What is certain is that the covert operations being conducted from Vietnam's hidden beaches had created the conditions for the incident, whatever its exact nature. The secret war had collided with the public war, with consequences that would reshape the conflict. The Phantom Fleet that conducted these operations was remarkable in its diversity. Norwegian-built Nasty-class patrol boats formed the backbone of the force, but they were supplemented by a variety of other vessels as the program expanded. Swift boats, modified for covert operations, were used for certain missions. Junks and sampans, indistinguishable from the thousands of civilian vessels that plied Vietnam's waters, were employed for agent insertions and reconnaissance. Each type of vessel had its strengths and limitations, and the planners who designed operations learned to match the platform to the mission. The Nasty boats were fast and heavily armed, ideal for hit-and-run strikes against defended targets. But their distinctive silhouette made them recognizable to enemy radar operators, and they were too large to operate in the shallow waters where some targets were located. The junks and sampans solved the shallow water problem but created others. They were slow and lightly armed, vulnerable if discovered by enemy forces. Their crews had to rely on stealth and deception rather than speed and firepower. And the agents they delivered were often operating alone or in small teams, without the support that the larger boats could provide. The men who crewed these vessels developed extraordinary skills through trial and error. They learned to read the water, to interpret the subtle changes in wave patterns that indicated shoals or reefs. They mastered the art of navigation without instruments, using the stars and landmarks to find their way along unfamiliar coasts. They developed techniques for approaching enemy shores undetected, timing their approaches to coincide with tidal and weather conditions that would mask their presence. The hidden beaches where these vessels were based were scattered along the entire length of South Vietnam's coast. In the north, installations near Da Nang and Hue supported operations against targets in North Vietnam and the coastal areas of Laos. In the central region, bases at Nha Trang and Cam Ranh Bay focused on interdicting the flow of supplies along the coast and into the Mekong Delta. In the south, installations near Vung Tau and in the delta itself supported operations against Viet Cong infrastructure in the region. Each installation had its own character, shaped by the geography of its location and the missions it supported. Some were elaborate complexes with hardened bunkers, sophisticated communications equipment, and extensive maintenance facilities. Others were little more than cleared stretches of beach where boats could be pulled out of the water and concealed under camouflage netting. The men who served at these installations came from every branch of the armed forces and from civilian agencies as well. Navy personnel operated and maintained the boats. Army Special Forces trained and advised the indigenous commandos who conducted many CIA officers, coordinated intelligence, and provided guidance on targets. And Marine reconnaissance specialists contributed their expertise in beach surveys and coastal operations. This mix of personnel created both challenges and opportunities. The different services had different cultures, different ways of doing things, different chains of command. Coordination was sometimes difficult, and friction between units was not unknown. But the diversity also brought a range of skills and perspectives that no single service could have provided alone. By 1968, the Phantom Fleet had grown to its maximum strength. Dozens of vessels of various types were operating from installations along the coast. Hundreds of missions were being conducted each year, ranging from simple reconnaissance patrols to complex multi-day operations deep in enemy territory. The intelligence being gathered was contributing to the targeting of airstrikes, the interdiction of supply lines, and the understanding of enemy capabilities and intentions. But the cost was mounting. Vessels were being lost at an increasing rate as North Vietnamese defenses improved. Crews were being killed or captured, their fates often unknown for years. and the effectiveness of the operations was being questioned by some who believed that the resources being devoted to maritime unconventional warfare could be better used elsewhere. The hidden beaches continued their work, but the men who served there could sense that change was coming. The war was shifting, the political landscape was transforming, and the secret operations that had seemed so vital were beginning to seem like relics of an earlier phase of the conflict. What none of them could know was that the most dramatic changes were still to come, and that the beaches they had worked so hard to conceal would soon face their greatest test. By the spring of 1972, the hidden beaches of Vietnam had entered their final chapter. The Paris peace accords were being negotiated, American forces were withdrawing, and the covert operations that had been conducted from the coast for nearly a decade were being wound down one by one. Lieutenant Commander David Chen stood on a beach near Da Nang, watching as equipment was loaded onto trucks for transport to Saigon. The installation where he had served for 18 months was being dismantled, its bunkers filled with sand, its communications equipment packed into crates that would eventually find their way to other theaters, other conflicts. Chen had arrived in Vietnam as a young officer, eager to prove himself in combat. He was leaving as something else entirely. The things he had seen, the missions he had participated in, the men he had lost, had transformed him in ways he was still trying to understand. The beach where he now stood had been his home, his workplace, his battlefield, and now it was becoming just another stretch of sand, indistinguishable from the thousands of miles of coastline that lined Vietnam's edge. The dismantling of the coastal installations was being conducted with the same secrecy that had characterized their construction. Documents were being burned, equipment was being sanitized, and the physical traces of the operations were being erased as thoroughly as possible. When the process was complete, there would be little evidence that the installations had ever existed, but the memories could not be erased so easily. The men who had served at the hidden beaches would carry those memories for the rest of their lives. The faces of comrades lost, the sounds of gunfire and explosions, the feel of sand beneath their feet as they watched boats disappear into the darkness, never to return. Chen thought about the missions he had been part of, the successes and the failures, the moments of triumph and the long nights of grief. He thought about the agents who had been inserted along the North Vietnamese coast, most of whom had been captured or killed within days of their arrival. He thought about the fast patrol boats that had struck targets from one end of the enemy coastline to the other, sometimes returning shot full of holes, sometimes not returning at all. Had it been worth it? The question haunted him, as it haunted many of the men who had served in the covert operations. The war was ending, and not in the way they had hoped. North Vietnam had not been forced to abandon its support for the insurgency in the south. The flow of supplies had been disrupted but never stopped, and the price paid in lives, both American and Vietnamese, had been staggering. But there had been successes too. Intelligence gathered from the coastal operations had contributed to countless airstrikes, countless interdictions, countless enemy plans disrupted before they could be executed. The men who had served at the hidden beaches had done what they were asked to do, had given everything they had sacrificed without recognition or reward. The official history would remember little of this. The covert operations would remain classified for decades, their participants bound by oaths of secrecy that many would honor until their deaths. The beaches would return to their natural state, reclaimed by the jungle and the sea, their secrets buried beneath sand and vegetation. But the men who had served there would remember. They would carry the weight of what they had done and what they had witnessed, would struggle to make sense of experiences that defied easy explanation. Some would find peace with their service, would come to believe that their sacrifice had meaning, even if it was never acknowledged. Others would be haunted by doubts, would question whether the cost had been justified, would wonder if there had been another way. Chen watched as the last of the equipment was loaded, as the trucks began their journey south. In a few hours, there would be nothing left to indicate that this beach had been anything more than a stretch of sand at the edge of the sea. The bunkers would be covered, the boat ramps destroyed, the communications antennas removed. He took one last look at the water, at the waves breaking against the shore in the same rhythm they had followed for millennia. The beach had witnessed so much in the years he had served there. It had seen courage and cowardice, triumph and tragedy, hope and despair. It had absorbed the blood of men who believed they were fighting for something important, something worth dying for. And now it was returning to silence. The war would continue for 3 more years, but the hidden beaches had completed their mission. The men who had served at them would scatter to other assignments, other lives, carrying with them the burden of secrets they could never share. The vessels that had operated from them would be transferred, destroyed, or left to rust in forgotten corners of naval bases around the world. But the legacy would endure, even if it remained hidden from public view. The tactics developed on Vietnam's beaches would be refined and applied in future conflicts. The lessons learned would be passed down to new generations of special operators, and the courage of the men who had served in the shadows would continue to inspire those who followed in their footsteps. Chen turned away from the water and walked toward the truck that would carry him to Da Nang. Behind him, the beach lay empty and quiet, returning to the state it had occupied before the war had transformed it into something else entirely. The secrets it held would remain buried for decades, waiting for the day when the truth could finally be told. 50 years have passed since the last American helicopter lifted off from the roof of the embassy in Saigon. The beaches of Vietnam have been transformed beyond recognition. Where hidden military installations once stood, luxury resorts now cater to tourists from around the world. The waters that once concealed fast patrol boats now carry pleasure craft and fishing vessels. The sand that absorbed the footprints of commandos heading into battle now bears the imprints of children building castles in the surf. But for those who know where to look, the echoes of the secret war remain. Thomas Brennan, the young lieutenant who stood on a hidden beach in 1967, watching the fog roll in from the South China Sea, lived to see the truth finally emerge. In the 1990s, as the classification of Vietnam-era documents began to be lifted, the story of the covert coastal operations gradually came to light. The men who had served in silence could finally speak of what they had done, could finally receive recognition for their sacrifice. Brennan returned to Vietnam in 2005, 68 years old, and still carrying the memories of his service. He found the beach where he had once stood, where he had watched boats disappear into the darkness and sometimes watched them return. The jungle had reclaimed most of the installation, but he could still trace the outlines of the bunkers, still find fragments of concrete from the boat ramps buried beneath the vegetation. He stood there for a long time, listening to the waves and thinking about the men he had known. So many of them were gone now, claimed by the war or by the years that followed. But their spirits seemed to linger on that beach, seemed to whisper in the wind that rustled through the palm trees. The secret beaches of Vietnam had served their purpose. They had been platforms for operations that shaped the course of the war, staging grounds for missions that pushed the boundaries of what unconventional warfare could achieve. They had been homes to men who served without recognition, who sacrificed without acknowledgement, who died without their stories being told. And now, finally, those stories could be shared. The legacy of the hidden beaches extends far beyond Vietnam. The tactics developed there, the lessons learned from successes and failures alike, formed the foundation for modern special operations. The men who served in those covert installations went on to train the next generation of warriors, passing down hard-won knowledge that would prove invaluable in conflicts yet to come. The Navy SEALs who patrol the world's coastlines today are the inheritors of a tradition that was forged on the beaches of Vietnam. The special operators who conduct missions in the shadows, whose actions are never acknowledged and whose sacrifices are never publicly honored, are following a path that was blazed by the men who served at Da Nang and Nha Trang, at Cam Ranh Bay and Vung Tau. The war itself remains controversial, its costs debated, its lessons disputed. But the courage of those who served is beyond question. They did what their country asked of them, faced dangers that most people cannot imagine, and carried the weight of secrets that could never be shared. Michael Dawson, the communications specialist who served at China Beach, became a teacher after the war. He never spoke of his service to his students, never mentioned the hidden installation where he had monitored missions and tracked the fates of men he never met. But he carried the lessons of that service with him every day, the understanding that some truths are worth protecting, that some sacrifices are worth making, that some secrets must be kept until the time is right to reveal them. He died in 2018, 82 years old, surrounded by family who finally learned the full story of his service only after his passing. Among his possessions was a photograph, faded with age, showing a group of young men standing on a beach, the South China Sea stretching out behind them. On the back, in his handwriting, were the words, "China Beach, 1969. We did what we were asked. We gave what we had. We remember those who gave everything. The hidden beaches of Vietnam have returned to nature now. The bunkers have collapsed, the boat ramps have crumbled, the communications equipment has rusted away. Tourists walk on sand that once felt the weight of commandos preparing for missions into enemy territory. They swim in waters that once concealed submarines and fast patrol boats. They have no idea what happened on the ground beneath their feet. But history remembers, even when the evidence has been erased. The stories that were classified for decades have now been told. The men who served in silence have finally been recognized. And the lessons of those hidden beaches continue to shape the way America wages war in the shadows. The waves still break against the shore, as they have for millennia, as they will for millennia more. They carry with them the echoes of a secret war, the whispers of men who served and sacrificed without recognition. They remind us that history is not always found in the headlines, that courage is not always acknowledged, that the full story of any conflict takes generations to emerge. The secret beaches of Vietnam were never meant to be remembered. They were designed to be forgotten, their traces erased, their stories buried. But the truth has a way of surfacing, like wreckage washed up on the shore after a storm. And the truth of what happened on those beaches, of what those men did and what they gave, deserves to be known. For in the end, the measure of a nation is not found only in its victories, but in how it honors those who served in its shadows. The men of Vietnam's hidden beaches served without expectation of recognition, sacrificed without hope of acknowledgement. They believed that what they were doing mattered, that their service had meaning, that their sacrifices would make a difference. History may still be debating whether they were right, but their courage, their dedication, their willingness to give everything for a cause they believed in, those qualities are beyond debate. They represent the best of what the human spirit can achieve, the highest calling that any person can answer. The sand remembers, even when we forget. The waves carry echoes of the past, even when we cannot hear them. And somewhere, on a beach that once held secrets, the spirits of those who served still stand watch, guardians of a truth that took half a century to emerge. Their story has finally been told. Their sacrifice has finally been honored. And their legacy will endure long after the last of them has passed, long after the beaches have been transformed beyond recognition, long after the war itself has faded into the mists of history. The hidden beaches of Vietnam remind us that war is not fought only on battlefields that the world can see. It is fought in shadows, in secrets, in places that are designed to be forgotten. and the men who fight in those shadows deserve to be remembered, honored, and thanked for their service. They gave everything, and now at last we know. If you watched this far, it's because this story touched your heart. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates the untold stories of those who served in silence. If this video moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who values military history and the courage of those who served. Every share helps these forgotten stories reach more people who deserve to hear them. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every week we uncover the hidden chapters of history that mainstream documentaries overlook. Join our community of history enthusiasts who believe that every sacrifice deserves to be remembered, every hero deserves to be honored, and every truth deserves to be told. Thank you for watching, thank you for remembering, and thank you for honoring those who served in the shadows so that we might live in the light.